A Canadian-owned social media channel that the U.S. Justice Department alleges is a key part of a Russian influence scheme is now off YouTube. YouTube said Tenet Media violated its community guidelines. Tenet Media was founded by Canadian Lauren Chen and her husband Liam Donovan last year. YouTube is also taking down 4 separate media channels owned by Chen. Chen is a right-wing commentator with posts supporting Donald Trump and siding with Russia over the war in Ukraine. And the U.S. Department of Justice indictment doesn't name Chen or her husband, and they don't face charges. But as the CBC's Evan Dyer tells us, Tenet is allegedly central to a Kremlin scheme to use millions of dollars to influence American public opinion and the U.S. presidential election.
One of the greatest enemies of our nation right now is Ukraine.
Influencers like Tim Pool, who worked with Tenet Media, were clear about who they didn't like and about who they did.
Trump, remember what they've done to you. Remember what they were trying to do to you. And please, please destroy these people once you get into office.
A U.S. federal indictment says those opinions were bought and paid for by the Kremlin, which funneled $10 million, in part through Roaming Millennial, a Quebec company belonging to Canadian influencer Lauren Chen and her husband Liam Donovan, who then used her Tennessee company, Tenet Media, to pay MAGA influencers like Dave Rubin, Benny Johnson, Tim Pool, and Canadian Lauren Southern to spread the Kremlin's pro-Trump, anti-Ukraine messages.
We have not seen an adversary attempt to influence an American election to this degree ever before.
This former FBI director of counterintelligence says the Russian president will be infuriated to see this operation rolled up.
The message the U.S. government is sending with these indictments is, we see you, we're on to you, and we're going to call this out.
The indictment says the influencers were paid up to $100,000 per video. Some have since declared themselves victims of the scheme who had no idea the money came from Russia. Previously, anti-Ukraine Tim Pool even put a Ukrainian flag in his bio. But owners Chen and Donovan allegedly billed the Russians directly. CBC News reached out to Chen, but she declined to comment.
The charging documents make it quite clear that they knew who they were dealing with.
So far, though, the FBI has charged only Russians, not the Canadians and Americans. The 2 main messages Tenet Media was allegedly paid to propagate were vote for Trump and defund Ukraine. But there was also a general directive to stoke anger around immigration, inflation, to say the country was broken and headed for civil conflict, anything that would weaken national unity and drag America down. Evan Dyer, CBC News, Ottawa.
Marcus Kolga is an expert on Russian foreign interference and disinformation and a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Marcus, it's good to meet you. Thank you for joining the show today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
This is quite the web that has been revealed here. I mean, we've got this 2 Canadian social media influencers right in the middle of this U.S. investigation into a multi-million-dollar disinformation campaign funded by Russia. How does something like this happen?
Well, look, it's been happening for a long time. The Russians are very good at identifying these sorts of individuals and capturing them and exploiting them, using them to advance their narratives. And they've been doing this for decades, going back to the Cold War. And certainly since 2014, that first invasion of Crimea. So, we've been monitoring a number of Canadians who have even beyond this web, who have been contributing to Russian state media channels like RT and Sputnik. And so it was no real surprise that this information came out, this indictment came out. What is truly shocking to me, though, is number one, the dollar amounts involved and the fact that Canadians are at the core of it. That to me was extremely surprising.
Okay, so on that, 2 of the names in this indictment, they've not been charged. So I do want to make that very clear. But Lauren Chen, who's an influencer known on social media, and her husband and business partner, Liam Donovan, it suggests in the indictment that they were aware of where the money was coming from, that their text messages, so they referred to their financiers as the Russians. But then you have a lot of the content creators who are getting big money, but claim they had no idea where it was coming from. I mean, what does the influencer's ignorance tell you about all this?
Well, I suspect that they're feigning ignorance. If you read through the indictment, I mean, it's quite clear that that the 2 who were indicted, these 2 Russians, that they were clearly directing content creation on this platform, and they would have been directly interacting with some of these individuals. So to say that they didn't see this coming, given the dollar amounts and the fact that they were instructed to push all sorts of Kremlin-aligned narratives, to me, it doesn't really hold water.
I mean, the money's enormous, right? You have some podcasters being paid $100,000 US per episode, like 40, 50 episodes a year, a lot of it undermining Ukraine. I mean, is that the main objective? Do you think it was to undermine support for the NATO and Western sort of defense in the war in Ukraine, or is it just general sowing of discord across the Western nations?
Yeah, well, look, there's two Russian information and influence operations generally have two primary objectives, certainly going back the past 2.5 years. So the first one, as you mentioned, is basically pushing anti-Ukrainian narratives, anti-NATO, anti-Western narratives, the kinds of narratives that might erode public support for Ukraine. And, we saw the impact of that down in the United States last year, where for nearly a year, extreme right-wing elements within the Republican Party were holding up support and funding for Ukraine. So that's one objective. The second objective, and this is one that's been going on with the Russians and one that the Russians have been trying to achieve for the past decades, is the undermining of our democracy and the breakdown of cohesion within our society. So you see two kinds of narratives. That on one side, they're directed towards the war, and the other, it's directed towards Canadians, Americans in our domestic politics.
Right, the general undermining of Western values and Western institutions, and then the more specific, make it harder for President Zelensky and his people to defend their country. It's interesting, though, some of the names that pop up in this, they got a lot of prominence during the convoy when Ottawa was occupied a couple of years ago. A lot of that movement very heavily covered on Russian television and in Russian media. What do we draw from, I know America's the big target, but what do we draw from these sort of Canadian elements that are being revealed in this entire thing?
Well, sure. I mean, the U.S. is a target, but let's remember that when these information operations occurred, they don't respect borders. And so if we're talking about the far left or the far right, when these narratives are injected into social media and into our information environment, they move around all over the place and ricochet here and there. And this indictment also demonstrates that Canadians are producing and amplifying a lot of these narratives. So, I think that borders, these information operations are agnostic of any sort of borders. Going back to your point about the convoy and the anti-vax movement, yeah, I mean, I was surprised during that convoy, during the trucker occupation of Ottawa, that RT was covering that story. They had a reporter on the ground in Ottawa, which was in one way surprising, in the other way not, because we know that Russia is very good at identifying and exploiting the most polarizing issues of the day, whether it's here in Canada or in the US. What was, I guess, a little bit concerning about those reports is that RT was giving a platform to some of the most extreme voices within that movement, the ones that were calling for the removal of our democratically elected government. And what's interesting with the timeline is that it actually jibes with that was the timeline that was presented in the indictment. So these individuals who were responsible for this platform that RT was paying for, according to the indictment, they were already operating and producing content for RT starting in October of 2021, which would mean that even during COVID, during those the trucker protests, that they were probably producing content at that same time.
All in the run-up to the invasion, of course, as well, right? Which is how the calendar lines up. But I wonder, so no charges laid against any of the, say, people with the Canadian company involved here or any of the influencers at this point. But Russian television, RT, and they have been sanctioned. So there is a potential for sanctions violations here. We don't have a foreign agent registry yet in Canada. It's in the works, but there is one in the United States. I mean, what are the possible consequences here for this type of behavior, witting, unwitting, or just being a useful idiot?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, RT was placed on Canada's sanctions list in June of 2022. And according to the indictment, this activity was ongoing through June 2024. And with our sanctions regulations, it forbids any sort of financial transactions with the entities named on it. And the indictment says very clearly that the two of the Canadians that were involved with this scheme were receiving payments from RT, and that some of those payments were deposited into a Canadian bank account. So it's very clear that the Canadian government needs to investigate this and for any potential sanctions violations. Let's not forget, we also have C70, which is the Foreign Influence Transparency Registry. This bill was passed already this past spring. It's not being fully implemented, but it is on the books, and so it'll be critically important that the Canadian government investigates this, and also to ensure that our intelligence community, law enforcement, also looks at other Canadians, the many other Canadians who have collaborated and contributed to content on RT and Sputnik, to see if they've received any sort of payment. Because, look, these people need to be held accountable if they're receiving payment from these entities in order to deter Canadians from, collaborating with other foreign authoritarian states in the future.
And that's a very good point to end it on, because the indictment does say that Russia has about 2,800 influencers, 600 of them in the United States. No clear breakdown for Canada, but let's face it, this stuff moves back and forth across the north-south border. Marcus Kolga, it was really good to meet you. Thank you for joining us today. Appreciate your time.
Anytime. Thanks for having me on.